The talk title for today is Love and Be Loved, with a dash in between, a hyphen in between. And I put it down that way because I was a little bit flummoxed about whether to make it Be Loved or Beloved. And what I realized after things went to presses is I really should just make it both. So really the talk title today is Love, Be Loved, and Beloved. And this talk today is actually inspired by my trip to Chiang Mai, Thailand. I was there for a couple of weeks in August, and it's the second time that I've gone to Chiang Mai. I just love that town. It's really enamored. I'm very enamored with it. And I think the reason is because it's kind of this ancient and modern city that's kind of nestled in the northern part of Thailand. And, you know, it's ancient. It even has a feudal wall, right? It has this wall that's 1 mile square that goes around the very center of it. The wall even has a moat still today around it. And then inside of the town, what you find is you find all of these Buddhist temples that are just scattered about, some on major streets, and they're the big ones, and then these little gyms that you find if you walk around and kind of get back behind everything on those little walkways that they have. You'll find these little gyms of temples back there also. And so I just love the city, and I spent my days there, my 2 weeks there. In the morning, I would do my studies because, as I mentioned, I'm in ministerial school, and I had a class called The Wisdom of Islam, which had 3 books you had to read, and I was a little behind on my reading. So I said, well, I'm going to get caught up on my vacation there. I'll do my readings in the morning and get caught up, which meant that I was really studying Islam in the mornings. In the afternoons, I would walk around and I would be adrift in this sea of Buddhism, because Thailand is a Buddhist country, and I would be visiting all of these temples. And so I was kind of experiencing Buddhism. And of course, wherever I go, I take my science of mind practices with me. And so I would be doing prayer, meditation. I do a lot of contemplation. And so I was taking science of mind with me too. So I was just kind of a bit adrift in these 3 different ways of looking at life. And the truth is, you know, while all 3 of them are monotheistic, meaning we all believe that there's one God, the relationship that we have to God is a little bit different in each one of those. And so I was kind of working through all of that, and it caused me to look at my life in relationship to God in a slightly different way. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that towards the end, but I want to kind of give you a little bit of the flavor of each of these religions, because, you know, we only study science of mind here, really. So I want to start first with Buddhism. Now, I could speak volumes and volumes on Buddhism, so I'm going to just talk a very little bit about it. But I'd like to start by talking about it as being a revealed religion, meaning that the Buddha is the person who revealed Buddhism, right? It came from a person. And the Buddha wasn't always the Buddha, right? The Buddha started out being Siddhartha, and I probably didn't exactly pronounce that right, so I'm just going to call him Sid. I don't think the Buddha's too attached to what I call him, you know? So Sid started out as an Indian priest. And, you know, his father, the king, had a seer come to see him when he was first born. And the seer said, "Your son is going to be a great spiritual leader," which didn't make the king very happy, because the king wanted him to be a great secular leader, right? He wanted him to follow in his footsteps. And so the king kind of cloistered off Sid and kept him away from everything that might draw him into spirituality, even when he was a young man. So there he is, he's married, he has children, and he's never been out of the palace. until the king goes for a state visit to the next door kingdom and is gone for a while, and Sid convinces his charioteer to take him out into the city where he sees suffering. He's never seen it before. He sees old age. He sees sickness. He sees death. And he comes back and he can't get rid of this feeling of, why do we suffer? Why do we suffer? And so he gave up everything that he had. He gave up being a prince. He gave up his family. And he went out to be to follow the life of a monk. And a life of a monk in those days, he would have been a Hindu monk, was basically a life of begging for food and going around to teachers. And for 6 years, he would go to all the teachers that he could find and ask them, why do we suffer? And nobody could answer the question to his satisfaction. And finally, after 6 years, he sat down under a tree that we now call the Bodhi tree, and he said, I'm going to sit here and meditate on why do we suffer, or I'm going to die. I'm going to get the answer, or I'm going to die. And fortunately for mankind, he did become enlightened. He came back with an answer, which is encompassed in what they call the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, which I'm not going to talk about. But it is a resolution to suffering, really, is what that is. What I would like to talk about is there's another layer underneath Buddhism. You know, when I have been introduced to Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path before, I kind of thought it was a heady religion. You know, because it's kind of this method, here's the problem, here's the method to get over it. What I didn't realize until later is there's a whole nother layer underneath Buddhism, which is what touches me so much. And it's the thought that we need to be compassionate, always. And what is compassion? Compassion is just knowing love for each other. And why do we know love for each other from a Buddhist standpoint? It's because we're all one, right? Buddhists know absolutely that we are all one, that there's no separation between us. And so if I love me, why wouldn't I love you, right? So here I am in Thailand, which is a Buddhist country. And I really feel like the Thai culture is buoyed up and lifted higher because they have this underlying belief in compassion that is so visible. You know, it's called the land of smiles for a reason. They are really a very sweet, compassionate group of people. And I have an example of this. When I was walking, as I was walking every afternoon, I once walked past this school, and it was later in the afternoon, and so school, I believe, was out by that time, and what I noticed was this group of boys, and they were maybe 14 or so, and they were skateboarding. Now, my middle son, if any of you remember Dylan, he doesn't live around here anymore, but he was an avid skateboarder, and all the way through his teen years into his adult years. And I've watched a lot of skateboarding over my years with Dylan. And so I thought, you know, I'll just stand here and watch these kids skateboard for a minute, see what their tricks were like, right? Well, as they were skateboarding, one of the boys fell. And he fell pretty hard. You know, he ended up, you know, down on the ground. And what I saw was all the other boys went around and they circled him. And I don't speak Thai, but what I could hear in their voice was love, compassion, support. Now, in America, you know, when you take that kind of a spill, the harder you fall, the more they laugh. And you know what you're likely to get for encouragement is something like, darn, or something else. That was so stupid. I'm not saying that our culture is bad and their culture is good. What I'm pointing at is this is the type of atmosphere that's just there, this feeling of compassion and love. There's an aura of love that I felt like I was just buoyed up in my afternoons as I would walk around and visit these temples that had been prayed in for centuries. In the mornings, meanwhile, I was studying Islam. And Islam is a very different religion than Buddhism because, well, as an example of it, if you are a follower of Islam, then you're a Muslim. The translation of Muslim is one who submits to God. So, you know, that phrase in and of itself means that you have a very different relationship between yourself and God than you do if you're a Buddhist. Now, there is a whole, they also believe, in one of their very basic sayings is there is no God but God, right? Just meaning that there's only one God. That's the God that we're all talking about here. So we're all on the same page there, but when you bury under, when you dig down a little bit lower into the layers of their beliefs, you find that there's two more things that go along with that. One of them is a word called tashbih, which from the Vision of Islam, which was the textbook I was reading, it says, tashbih demands that they see him being God, closer to themselves than their own jugular vein. Can you imagine God closer to yourself than your own jugular vein? And so that's really talking about oneness. It's really talking about no separation. So we're right on board with that, right? But the next piece is another concept called tanzit. And from the same book, it says, tanzit demands that people see God as infinitely beyond themselves and infinitely different. And the thing that's interesting is both of those things in Islam are true at exactly the same time. It's not that one's true sometimes and the other one's true other times. Both of them are true at exactly the same time. And so I really spent a lot of time trying to figure this out, right? To really understand it, because when I study these religions, I really want to get down and get into the religion and understand it. So I read some more, and I'm very thankful that the teacher for the class is a Sufi sheikh, meaning that he's a teacher of Sufism. And Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. And so he had a book that we read also called, his name is Robert Frager, in the book Sufi Talks, he says, nothing is owed to us, and anything we might receive comes out of God's infinite generosity. God's infinite generosity. It's a very different perspective to me in my relationship to God. And it took a while. It took a couple of weeks, actually, to really get into that and feel the meaning of that. But as I understood more, as I really allowed myself to go into that, one of the things that it did for me, I mean for me, is it made me feel more humble than I've ever felt before. And it made me feel more awe for God than I've ever felt before. And so, as I understood this presence that God is, which Science Mind basically does agree that God is more than we are. Right? I'll talk about that in a moment. But as I really, really sat with that, for the first time, I think I really felt God loving me. And I know from Science of Mind we don't exactly agree with that statement. because we say God is love, and I'll talk some more about that in just a second. But you can see that people loving me is actually God loving me. And that's where I ended up leaving Islam, knowing that I can be loved, that I am being loved always. So meanwhile, I'm doing my science of mind practices. Prayer, meditation, contemplation, readings. And, science mind is similar in its relationship to God in that it knows that God is more than we are. It knows that we are the same and more. Ernest Holmes, but there is no judgment, right? There's actually very much written into Islam, there's a layer of judgment. God is judging us. There's a return, there's time of judgment, all that. But in Science of Mind, Ernest Holmes' most famous saying is, there is a power for good in the universe greater than you are, and you can use it. Absolutely true. But what the time with Islam reminded me is that greater than you are part. And so you can take that statement and you can morph it a little bit, and I've been looking to see if it's actually written by Ernest. I can't find it written by Ernest. But you can take that statement and you can say, there is a power for good in the universe greater than I, and it can use me. It can use me. And I think that's the more important statement in the long run. It's very, very important that we understand our relationship to God and that we can create out of that presence, out of that power, into our life, the life of our dreams, absolutely. And there's a relationship that we need to develop with God where it can also use us. Joanne Bourgeois, who many of you know, one of our practitioners who's taught many classes, always says, God's relation to me is impersonal, meaning God as love, as joy, as peace, as abundance, that its connection to me, it gives it to me just the way it gives it to anybody else. It creates my life out of itself just like anybody else. There's no personal relationship from that perspective. It doesn't choose one as a favorite over the other. But she goes on to say, my relationship to God is very personal. And that's where I get to choose. I get to have my own relationship to God. I get to decide for myself exactly how I'm going to relate to God. I can ignore God. I can decide God doesn't exist. I can decide God is judging me. Or I can decide I love God. I can sit in awe of God and love God. If I do that, then God has become the beloved. So here I was in Thailand in this stew of love, be loved, and the beloved. And what I found was I had a lot of questions. A lot of questions for myself. And I'm just going to read a few of them. First, from Buddhism on the love, how do I love in this world? How do I love more broadly? How do I send my love out more? From Islam, being loved, how do I embrace this quality of being loved? Do I recognize God as the source of that love? Do I allow the love to come into my life from others? Where do I put up barriers to that love? Where do I distrust? Where do I keep myself safe between, for me, my own personal barriers of order? And third, from Science of Mind, beloved, how do I embrace knowing God as the beloved? How do I recognize God in all aspects of my life? How do I see the good that God is always? How do I allow God to use me? So, you probably noticed that there were a bunch of questions and no answers. That's because the answers are personal. The answers that you hear for those questions are going to be your own answers, specific to you. And the challenge, I think, is to continue to live in the question and then listen for the answer and be willing to put that into effect in your life. So what I'm asking is, maybe in the coming week, are you willing to sit in the question? Are you willing to ask yourself questions about love, being loved, and the beloved? Thank you, and namaste. So let's go into a little bit of prayer. I drop down inside of myself to the place that knows that it knows that it knows. I drop down inside of myself to that place that knows the love that God is, knows it in all of its forms, knows it as love, as being loved, as the beloved. It knows itself in all the ways that we show up in our lives. It knows ourself as this life, as this power, as this presence that is so much beyond what we can actually know and touch and feel. And yet it's here. It's here inside of us, this consciousness that God is, living itself fully as us, completely as us, with no separation, knowing that the consciousness that I am, the love that I am, the peace that I am, the joy that I am, is the same for you. That it all comes from this one source that is God. And so it's from that place of knowingness that I absolutely speak my word, knowing that that life, that power, that presence that God is living itself as us, being the love that underscores everything in our life, being the power and the joy and the peace that lifts us high. Knowing all of that as the truth of our lives, I just know that we're absolutely blessed, individually and as a community, as a world. That blessing ripples out forevermore. And I just release this word into the law, knowing it's already fulfilled in the mind that God is. And I say life and God are good and very good. And together we say, and so it is.